Today, some of our best segments from the global lane. Presidential longevity in China. What might a third five-year term for President Xi Jinping mean for East Asia and the world? Thousands of party leaders gathered for the 20th Chinese Communist Party Congress in Beijing this week, where they applauded Xi's achievements of the past 5 years and laid out plans for the next 5. Here to provide some insights on what to expect is retired Brigadier General Robert Spalding. Mr. Spalding is author of War Without Rules, China's Playbook for Global Domination. General Spalding, Rob, it's great to talk with you again. First, your thoughts on this Communist Party Congress. Have you noticed anything different from the last gathering, say, 5 years ago, or is it more of the same?
Well, I think the big difference is the recognition that Xi's going to be around for the rest of his life. You know, there was speculation prior to this that maybe maybe there was a coup, maybe he was being moved out. It's clear that he is going to continue to lead the Chinese Communist Party forward. And so from that standpoint, I think his speech on Sunday laid out a pretty clear message that the things that people find terribly egregious about the Chinese Communist Party, in particular his leadership of the party, are going to continue and accelerate. So I don't expect much to change in terms of the things that seem to be frustrating to a lot of people out there.
Well, if the CCP is in this continual state of war without rules that you mentioned in your book, specifically then, where do you expect China to dominate militarily? On the sea, with an expanded navy, leaps forward in outer space, cyberspace, AI, where?
Well, I think all of the above. One of the challenges that they'll have now that the Biden administration has really gone after the chip industry, assisting them in elevating their chip technology. I think they're going to be hindered by that, just in their ability to have the most advanced chips. That still means that they do have some chip industry. It's just going to be several generations behind where the United States is. That being said, militarily they're looking pretty squarely at Taiwan, and she said that. And I think one of the things that we have to consider is that at any time, particularly after this party Congress, and then March is when they lay out the next 5-year plan, I can expect, or we can expect that it's possible the Chinese can invade nearly at any time after this party Congress is over.
Well, at that CCP Congress, you mentioned President Xi again threatened Taiwan. The Chinese economy is in decline a bit, and the United States is China's top trading partner, more than $500 billion in goods each year. So how can they afford a conflict with the U.S. right now in Taiwan or anywhere else?
Well, they have been accelerating their transition to their own market economy based on the Belt and Road Initiative, their relationship with Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and other authoritarian states. They and the Russians in particular, and the Iranians and North Koreans for that matter, all want to get off the dollar. So it seems that what they're going to try to do, or attempt to do, is use the yuan or the renminbi, the Chinese currency, as the dominant currency in that system. And when you look across the nations of the Belt and Road Initiative, they get a lot of energy from Russia and Iran. They have raw materials from countries in Africa and other areas. And so they're going to create their own economy that's based on nations that follow the Chinese model, which is a model of oppression of their people. And, unfortunately for the Chinese, and the Chinese people, they've had access to the U.S. and other free market economies for over 3 decades. That's allowed them to take technology, talent, and capital. So hopefully, going forward, as we recognize the second Cold War, we'll begin to treat these nations, these authoritarian nations, like we did the Soviet Union, and cut them off from that technology, talent, and capital. And the first indication that things are going that way is the fact that the Biden administration just announced that they're going after the Chinese chip industry in a big way. And essentially, when you look at it from the Chinese side, what they're saying is they've essentially decapitated China's ability to evolve their chip industry. So that's a good first start. Clearly not enough, because there's other things like pharmaceuticals and rare earth metals that we've got to get after. But if we keep this up, I think we're on a good path.
And the Chinese government told its citizens in Ukraine this week to evacuate immediately. That warning fueled fears of a Russian nuclear attack in the war there. So, what do you make of that?
Well, I do. I am concerned that we're closer to the use of a nuclear weapon than we ever were during the Cold War, precisely because during the Cold War there was still a respect and fear for those types of weapons. And what I feel that I see today in nations' capitals around the world is this more or less cavalier attitude when nuclear weapons are discussed. Oh, that's not a possibility. Putin would never do that. The weapons never went away, but the seriousness and respect and some of the fear that we had for those weapons has disappeared from capitals around the world, to include Washington, D.C. Now, that gives me great pause, because I do think that we'll be willing to push Putin in ways that we probably wouldn't have done during the Cold War, because we recognize the danger of having those weapons be used. And so, the standoff, for instance, the Cuban Missile Standoff. President Kennedy was wide awake and understood the implications of nuclear war, and understood the seriousness, understood the damage, and the quite, how close we were to destroying humanity. And I think that's the kind of fear and respect that politicians in the West and the free world need to understand, because I know that for a fact that Putin is as seriously considering those weapons, because of the way that he still understands that in many ways those weapons didn't go away, and they're still an important part of his arsenal.
Retired U.S. Air Force Brigadier General Robert Spalding, author of the book War Without Rules, China's Playbook for Global Domination. We always appreciate your insights. Thanks for being with us, Rob.
Thank you.
Population bomb or bust? While climate change activists tell us the world is heading for extinction if we fail to act now, in reality, humans may face extinction in a number of countries because their populations are having fewer babies. Marian Tupy, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute, joins us to provide more insights. He's author of the book Superabundance: The Story of Population Growth, Innovation, and Human Flourishing on an Infinitely Bountiful Planet. Marian, in the late 1960s, Paul Ehrlich, in his book, The Population Bomb, predicted global famine, other societal turmoil due to overpopulation. Now it looks like underpopulation is a growing problem. Tell us what is happening and why we need to be concerned.
Paul Ehrlich, who is still alive, he's a biologist at Stanford University, was looking at the huge explosion of population around the world in the 1960s after the end of the Second World War. And that was indeed happening. And in 1968, he wrote a book, The Population Bomb, which predicted that hundreds of millions of people would die in the 1970s and the 1980s, regardless of what humanity did in order to come up with solution to this massive increase in population. But in fact, whilst the population of the world has indeed risen, we did not see that happening. In fact, since 1960s, commodities have been becoming less expensive. They've been becoming more affordable. I can just tell you that the price of coffee, for example, dropped by 96%, the price of wheat by 88%, the price of corn by 87%. So over a span of 70 years, while the population of the world was exploding, everything has become cheaper, with partial exception on some years of gold and oil.
And we've seen one-way flights recently full of people departing Russia after President Putin issued his military draft order to mobilize people to fight in Ukraine. But Russia was already losing population. The country may likely see a decline of nearly 1 million people just this year. So tell us what's happening in Russia and why.
Well, Russian population has been declining with a few exceptions since really the 1980s. Part of it had to do with difficult living conditions and alcoholism, which has resulted in shorter lifespans. Their healthcare isn't very good either, so a lot of people die unnecessarily. But since the invasion of Ukraine and since the mobilization call, a lot of people have decided to leave Russia for Georgia and the Baltics and other places because they don't want to die in a war. But that is sort of just a Russia-centered view. fertility rates have been declining throughout most of the world. In order to maintain population stable, you need 2.1 babies per woman per lifetime. But in most of the developed West, including the United States, fertility rates are much lower. In our own country, it's only 1.7 per native-born woman. Of course, our population is still growing because of immigration. But in other countries which do not have huge immigration inflows, the situation is even more dire. In South Korea, for example, it's only 0.9 babies per woman per lifetime instead of 2.1. Japan, France, Britain, most of Western Europe, Central Europe, all of us have population growth rates below replacement level.
So what's the consequence of that? What's the result? Are we going to see nations disappear?
Well, if the trends continue, now the trends may continue for a variety of reasons. There are good reasons and there are bad reasons. The good reason is that a lot more women decide for themselves how many babies they want to have. Maybe they want to get a job, make a lot of money. Those are the sorts of reasons that we have to accept by living in a free society. But then there are negative reasons for falling fecundity. And one of them is, of course, extreme environmentalism, which is something that we have decided to tackle in this book that we wrote called Superabundance. Basically, parental choices don't happen in a vacuum. Parental choices happen as a result also, in part, of the sort of philosophical zeitgeist, the ideas in the air. And a lot of people, men and women who want to have children, are telling pollsters that they are refusing to have children because they believe that the world is going to end in a few years, because they believe that bringing a child into the world is a crime or an act of selfishness, because they believe that population of the world, humanity, is a cancer on the planet. So what we are trying to say in this book is that the planet is actually in a very good shape, and if past is if past is to teach us anything, it's very likely that children in the future are going to have an even better future than we have the current present.
Okay, Marian Tupy, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute. Thank you, Marian, for providing those insights. We appreciate it. Are Jewish students being denied their civil rights at the University of California, Berkeley? The dean of Berkeley Law School, Erwin Chemerinsky, says a rash of media reports about Jewish-free zones being established at that university are not true. Dean Chemerinsky says only a handful of student organizations, fewer than 10 out of 100, have adopted anti-Israel bylaws, which include a ban against pro-Israel speakers. The law school dean also says he strongly objects to the student actions, which are clearly unconstitutional. Freedom of speech, dissent, and debate is alive and well at Berkeley. Well, here with us is the man whose op-ed exposed what is happening at Berkeley. Kenneth Marcus is the founder and chairman of the Brandeis Center for Human Rights and former assistant secretary for civil rights at the U.S. Department of Education. Ken, thank you for coming on the show. So what did you think of the dean's response? Less than 10% of Berkeley student organizations actually adopted those bylaws banning Jews from expressing pro-Israel views. Your thoughts?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. I appreciate your interest, and I appreciate your bringing this to your audience's attention. Dean Chemerinsky is one of the country's most distinguished constitutional law experts, as well as being the dean of the law school. I thought his response was utterly outrageous. The notion that it should be, acceptable for only 9 student organizations at a law school to exclude Jews from opportunities just because there are others that say it's okay. What would he say if the mayor said there are 9 neighborhoods where Black, Hispanic, or Chinese people can't live, but don't worry because there are many others where they can live? What if there had been any other context in which any other group was shut out of opportunities? Would a law school dean in the 21st century say, not to worry, it's okay to have 9 segregated areas, just so long as we have many other areas that aren't segregated? I think he should be embarrassed about having made this argument. It's utterly absurd, ridiculous, and inconsistent with American law.
So is this speech ban anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, or just anti-Israel?
Well, it's all of those. Pick your poison. To begin with, it is a method of silencing one side of a political debate. It is a way of saying we should not permit anyone to participate in a discussion on campus if they are pro-Israel. This is anti-discourse, it's anti-speech, it's anti-education. It prevents even someone who is critical of Israel from having an informed education on the topic. But it's also anti-Jewish. Because the overwhelming majority of American Jews support Israel and consider support for Israel to be an important part of their identity as Jewish Americans. So when these groups say no Zionists, they are almost effectively saying no Jews. Dean Chemerinsky, to his credit, concedes that this would block him from speaking to these groups, and he says that it would also potentially block 90% or so of his law students from speaking to these groups. In addition, it would no doubt prevent some of the faculty as well. So it is a considerable assault on free speech, but it's beyond that. It's also discriminatory and an assault on the Jewish community.
And you're a graduate of Berkeley Law School. In addition to serving as Assistant Secretary of Civil Rights at the Department of Education, you served as Staff Director at the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. I'd say you know Berkeley law and civil rights well. So is this a civil rights violation? Would there be a case here against Berkeley, your alma mater?
Well, you know, I am a litigator and a civil rights lawyer, and the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights under law does file lawsuits in cases such as this. I don't want to say right now what we're going to do, but it is hard to look at this circumstance and to argue that the University of California is complying with federal law. They are a public institution. They are bound by the Constitution, including the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, as well as the various civil rights statutes protecting students, protecting lecturers, and protecting others.
Okay, Kenneth Marcus, founder and chairman of the Louis Brandeis Center. Thank you for sharing your time and insights. We appreciate it. Students at the University of Southern California are getting some financial help for producing pro-abortion films. USC's Annenberg School of Communications has announced its Inclusion Initiative program will provide a minimum of 3 students with $25,000 each to help fund script development and production. Well, here to explain is Emily Fowler. She's campus reform correspondent and student at the Masters University in Santa Clarita, California. So, Emily, I'm sure those behind this Annenberg program would say, well, we're a private university, so what's wrong with USC funding short documentaries about reproductive health, which, by the way, is an educational program advocating abortion? What do you think?
So the University of Southern California's Journalism School is giving $100,000 worth of grants to help rising seniors produce films about reproductive rights. And like you said, when we say reproductive rights, this university means pro-abortion ideology. And this is a private university, but even at private universities, you have a diverse group of people with different ideas, right? So what this university is doing is a very clear bias in higher education because they are encouraging and promoting only one point of view, and that is the pro-abortion point of view. So then the pro-life students are being denied an opportunity that they could have to showcase their point of view on this particular issue.
It seems that they're now teaching students to be advocates for a particular position. So what happens to those journalism and communication students who favor a more balanced approach, like you mentioned, those who may want to, say, report about adoption or about women who have regretted their decision to have an abortion? What happens to them?
So at this university in particular, these students are going to be probably looked down upon for their views. At the University of Southern California, the dean came out in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision on Roe v. Wade and said blatantly that she thought it was healthier for a woman to have an abortion than to actually give birth. And when you have leaders at these universities coming out and publicly making statements like that, it's very discouraging to pro-life students, and they're going to feel completely unable to showcase their views on campus. Because why would you think, if the dean of the university is coming out and saying things like that, then if I was a student there, I would think, why would I ever make a pro-life film, I would get a horrible grade. And so they're making decisions based off how they think their message is going to be received.
Emily Fowler, thank you so much for setting us straight today.
Thank you for having me.
This Thanksgiving, are you taking your history lesson about America's founding from the Pilgrims or the New York Times? The Times 1619 Project teaches that America's founding government and economy are based on slavery and white supremacy. It's the idea that America actually began in 1619 when the first African slaves arrived in Virginia. Folks, I'm here to share the truth. Like 30 million other Americans, I'm a descendant of Puritans who arrived in North America on the Mayflower in November 1620. Thanksgiving is a perfect time to commemorate the 400th anniversary of that historic event. You see, my 9th great-grandfather, Thomas Rogers, and 101 other pilgrims came to America seeking religious freedom. They fled tyranny and religious persecution in England. The British monarchy decreed that the Puritans and others would be punished if they did not conform to the beliefs of the Church of England. And when Thomas Rogers and 40 others signed the Mayflower Compact, they committed Plymouth Colony to godly governance. They wrote they'd be governed, quote, for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith. And that covenant had a profound and lasting impact on America. Listen to Dr. Jerry Newcomb, producer of the documentary The Pilgrims.
The Pilgrims gave us the Mayflower Compact, which was an agreement for self-government under God, which was really the first step in the creation, ultimately, of the Declaration of Independence and of the U.S. Constitution.
So, folks, like the Pilgrims, let's pray and commit ourselves to godly governance. And this Thanksgiving, let's rejoice, be thankful for God's blessings and for those Pilgrim settlers who provided this country with a godly foundation. They rejected slavery and embraced the freedom and joy which they knew in their hearts could only come from a heavenly king, not an earthly one. Well, that's it today from the Global Lane. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube, Parler, and Twitter. And until next time, be blessed.